We've made it in the after-lunch session, and you're at least crowding in and not sleeping, and I'll come and wake you up if you do doze off, because we need you to stay awake. So you have to come forward. You can't do yoga at the back. Come on. Okay, good. If you start waving frantically, we'll run over and help. Okay, good. Brilliant. So thanks very much. Welcome to Streaming Media West. It's the last set of sessions of the day. It's the afternoon session. It's B203. Internet radio yesterday, today and tomorrow. So my name's Don Robinson, and for those of you that don't know me, I've been writing for Streaming Media Magazine since 2002, so 16 years now. Traditionally, used to cover a lot of CDN stuff. I ran my own CDN for a while. Many of the assets actually have landed on this man's shoulder. We'll introduce him in a minute and explain that. And then for my day job, I do business development and sales for a software company that delivers live streaming platforms for premium delivery, usually for large enterprises like Nasdaq and Perform, so live sports and news and that sort of thing, which I can bore the tears off you with at another time, because today we're here to talk about internet radio, and I can tell from the crowd that's rushed in that we're absolutely passionate about this subject. I want to just start off with a little experiment. I'm going to ask them just to turn the microphone down in a second, but I want to just try a little experiment. I want to just highlight, in the world of video, how incredibly important audio is to our senses. So if you just shut your eyes, I'm going to play a tune just off the speaker on my phone, and as soon as you recognise it, I want you to stick your hand out. You don't need to be able to name it. I just want to make sure you can recognise it. So, okay, kill the speakers for a second. So just for the people who couldn't hear that, there was a little tune playing. Copyright reasons we couldn't live stream it, but little tune playing there was Nirvana's Come As You Are, and that was just a little test to show how, I reckon if I held up and played a video on this phone, probably very few of you would have been able to see it, let alone recognise it. But even with just the speaker on my smartphone, you guys, even right at the back, you guys could all identify a well-known tune. And I think that just highlights how incredibly important audio is to our overall senses, and how I think that sometimes it gets treated as a second-class citizen in the streaming media ecosystem. So, and I've been very passionate. I started out streaming in the mid-90s, and it was all about internet radio. Using RealNetworks was my foray into the space. And I've always remained very passionate about the amazing use you can make of the internet to deliver not just music but all sorts of audio and so on. So I put to Eric a little earlier this year that it was time to do a bit of a retrospective and have a look at what's happened in the internet radio space over the last 25 years. And I thought it was going to be a brief article. It ended up having to be cut in two, because there was just so much information, so much enthusiasm from people that I spoke to about their voyage through the last 25 years of internet radio. So I asked Eric if we could follow up the article with a panel at Streaming Media West to gauge the interest, see what passion is out there for the topics, for the audio space, and in particular start the ball rolling with a focus on internet radio. Before I start firing questions at these guys, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and then we're going to have a sort of rambling exploration of 25 years of internet radio. If you do have questions, feel free to just interrupt and stick your hand up. Otherwise, I'll turn to you for questions towards the end of the session. But let's hear from our panelists first of all. So first of all, we're going to go from left to right. Dane, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your company?
Of course. So my name's Dane Streeter. I'm managing director of SharpStream UK. We're responsible for the distribution of live and on-demand radio content for radio stations, government institutions, and international brands. Effectively, we enable our customers to distribute, monetize, and analyze their content through a single integration.
Cool. Excellent.
Great. My name's Ken Murphy. I'm the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Corporate Development for Rhapsody International. I guess we'd be best described as kind of the unholy union of two really early pioneers in the streaming audio space. Rhapsody, which was the very first fully licensed subscription music service, and Napster, which was, I guess you'd call, the very first unlicensed provider of digital music services in the space. Today, however, what we principally do is help companies like iHeartMedia, Telefonica, and others provide on-demand and subscription-based streaming music services. But a lot of our business right now is sitting at the intersection of traditional broadcast radio and on-demand. So we're really happy to be here to talk about the evolution of all that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ken. John.
Awesome. Hi, I'm John Stephenson. I am CEO of Media Creek, which is the holdings company of Live365 and Empire Streaming. Live365, as you may know, is a do-it-yourself internet radio platform. It's been around since about 1999. Our company actually went and bought their assets out of bankruptcy court back in 2016, and we successfully relaunched the platform with about 1,200 radio stations. And then Empire Streaming is a audio-centric content delivery network where we help a lot of larger organizations power their live streaming and on-demand operations.
And Reza.
Hello, I'm Reza Rassool, CTO of RealNetworks. I feel like somewhat of a charlatan on this panel, though. Even though RealNetworks was the originator and the inventor of streaming media, with the first streaming media protocols, we formed a separate company for our streaming media, streaming audio service that became Rhapsody, now a separate public corporation, and my colleague Ken here represents that entity. So what happened, I guess video killed the radio star. I've moved more onto video codec work at RealNetworks, so I look after that development, and also a more recent innovation from RealNetworks is a product line called Safer, which is a computer vision platform specializing in facial and object recognition.
Cool, excellent. Okay, so what I want to do is set the stage a little bit and ask each of our panelists just to give me some anecdote about what first made them aware of internet radio, got them into internet radio, maybe stories about first webcasts, first use of the technology and so on. So sweep left to right. So Dane, give us a kick off with that.
Sure. So I ended up actually getting really involved in or fell in love with the idea of internet audio back when I was 16. I was just finishing school, and I listened to some of the early A State of Trance broadcasts online, like a big trance radio show, basically, each week online, and they actually sell that to other publishers as well. But I first discovered it as an audio stream. Back in the day, it was a Windows Media audio stream, direct URL, and the idea of that concept was pretty cool. So fast forward like 3 or 4 years later to get the opportunity to then obviously work with you and actually on an audio streaming network was kind of an amazing use case from where I ended up falling in love with it to actually managing it today.
Cool, excellent, Ken.
Yeah, so for me, not dissimilar. Actually, it was stumbling upon it before I even worked in the space. I was a huge jazz fan. I was living in a market that didn't really have a great jazz station suddenly, and stumbled upon a website that pointed to a real media-powered stream that was delivering K-Jazz out of Los Angeles. And so it suddenly became a way that I could hear a kind of music that I loved that I had a hard time finding locally. And then from there, I just kind of got hooked on the format, and particularly got hooked in the early days, even when I was not involved in the music business. I was in the games business, but just watching the evolution of streaming music and the advent of Pandora and iHeart and the on-demand services, to me, it was a revolutionary way to consume this content. And so that's how I got hooked early.
So John, I started off using Live365 for a lot of my early streams, but
Did you?
Yeah, tell us about your.
So I actually got into radio. I had like a pirate radio station actually that went like a mile from my house. I worked out of my parents' basement, and one of my friends actually was like, "Hey, you should check out this website called Live365.com." And this was like 2006, 2007. So started obviously broadcasting online. Like we got a DSL internet connection, got a Dell computer for Christmas, and then started doing my first webcast in like early 2007 on Live365, and also Shoutcast at the time too. So that's basically my foray into internet radio, and then kind of started networking with people and decided to get into business in it. So.
Wow. So it's amazing, John, that you also had an FM pirate radio station like I had. When I was a teenager in high school, we made a small FM transmitter that transmitted in the valley that we lived in, just underneath the BBC's radio signal that would fly over the top. You never actually knew what frequency you're going to transmit on. You know, the circuit would warm up, and so we'd have to find our radio station on the radio, and then call our buddies and say, hey, we're transmitting on 88 point blah, whatever it is. And it was a dial-in radio station. So the way we did it was we would record an hour show, we would transmit it from the bedroom of my school friend, and then we'd go down to the local laundrette, and we'd given the payphone number out of the laundrette to take the dial-in requests, and then we'd go back and record the next hour. So it was extremely innovative, and years later, so that got me a love of audio and an appreciation of how you can transmit entertainment in audio, and the attention to detail that you had to provide. And it's lamentable that audio is the red-headed stepchild of digital entertainment, often neglected, and high time we make a change.
Definitely. I'm almost tempted to just segue straight into a question off the back of that, but I just wanted to... Okay. I think we need a bit of a definition of terms. So very specifically, we're talking internet radio today. Now, when I did the article, there were some interesting interpretations of the definition of internet radio. And I think it does mean slightly different things to different people. One of the things that I discovered was there's a chap, Carl Malamud, who was widely proclaimed as the first internet radio DJ. But actually, being puritanical, he was the first internet podcaster, because everything he did was pre-recorded and subsequently released. So I went on. I found a chap, Dave Hayes, who'd been broadcasting on the M-Bone actually 3 years before Carl, doing live linear jazz streams, basically, right at the beginning of '91. Only to a closed group, effectively, within the M-Bone. But he, in my mind, was truly an internet radio DJ, because he played a disc live to an audience that was synchronously listening, and then he back announced it afterwards. And that, for me, sort of closed the loop. Do you think that that's a good definition? So this is going to come along the panel. But do you think that synchronicity, that one-to-many live broadcast, is a good definition of internet radio, or do we count, playlisted services? I'm sure there's going to be different feelings along the line here, but do we count personalised playlisted services like listening to Spotify? Is that internet radio, or is that just a playlist? What do you think?
For me, it's exactly that. It's something that's curated by a human, where there's feedback from the audience, and then that broadcast is consumed simultaneously by many people at the same time, so that you are experiencing that together.
Ken, do you have any difference in opinion on
that? A little bit, perhaps. I don't disagree with the definition, and I think it's a very useful definition, because it describes a mode of curation, like you were saying, Stephen, that really does sort of define what people think of as radio. And I agree that kind of what we know today as internet radio, the sorts of algorithmic streams or semi-personalized streams that you get with Pandora, don't really align with that sort of content. So I accept the definition. I do think going forward that definition is going to be challenged, and that there is a lot of opportunity in the intersection points between those two modes of consumption. But I think as a place to jump off for our conversation today, I agree with the underlying definition.
Okay, brilliant. John?
Yeah, I would definitely agree. It kind of boils down to what was radio truly back in the day, and it's more of that sense of community, where you're experiencing something in real time with a bunch of other people, and you kind of have that connection with a human actually creating this on the other side, whether it's voiceovers in the middle of songs or whatever. I feel like that's truly what music is, whereas if you're just streaming back playlists or anything like that, I mean, I classify them more as, I guess, a music service. So, yeah.
So you get the feel that the DJ or the presenter is a personality you can trust, who's the taste maker, who's actually done the curation. I think that element is important, but maybe he did create the playlist at some time. And so I'd be a bit nuanced in that, unless you also including the content as well, the music or the entertainment, and insisting that that was live, because after all, isn't an LP, isn't an album a curation of content as well? So I wouldn't be too rigid about it, but the completely automated, massive 19-inch rack of servers in Atlanta making you feel like it's a local radio station, I think that is a bit too far.
Cheating a bit.
Yes.
I'd maybe even offer one more delineation that I think is really critical, and that's that it's easy to equate a music service that has radio-like playback with radio and ask if they're the same thing. I'd argue that one of the things that matters the most about radio is the mix of audio content that's delivered. That music is just a part of news and on-air personality and weather and traffic and a lot of other content that is really unique in that kind of linear delivery and checks a lot of boxes for a lot of people. You can see it with like how much broadcast radio is still consumed in the world. It's still the #1 media format in the world. And so I think it's more than just the music that defines it.
So I think you hit a really interesting point, which is a good step into the next question. This engagement that you get with internet audio and internet radio as a whole, I think is staggering. The volumes of engagement that you guys must see on your platforms probably absolutely dwarfs the volumes of engagement on any video platform. Traffic-wise, obviously not. It's lower bitrate traffic, but engagement-wise, I mean, do you guys see that? The CDN numbers I know from most CDNs are quite staggering. You do a lot of delivery.
Yeah, I mean, we're pushing out something along the lines of, I think it's almost 1 billion hours a month, something like that, in terms of content. It's a lot.
And you guys are seeing these
it's the same for us, particularly when you're talking about a paid subscriber, right? That somebody stays active in the service. I mean, this is a consumer that's going to consume 750 songs on a monthly basis. It's not unusual to have 20, 25 hours worth of engagement going on the platform. So there's a tremendous amount of engagement that occurs. And the other thing that's really interesting is the mix of engagement that is, we call it like lean back versus lean forward, right? Lean back listening, where it's obvious that they're not hand curating everything they're doing, versus lean forward, where they're obviously interacting with the applications and picking and selecting, making playlists, things like that. And the balance and mixture of all of that, I think, is kind of unique to these services.
John, any thoughts about the user engagement? You must be...
Yeah, I mean, specifically for our webcasters, I mean, it's amazing the amount of passion that people put into it and the amount of time that they spend creating webcasts on our platform. There's people that are very meticulous about the order of the songs that they want to be heard on their broadcast. I mean, often even before like our alerts will catch it, they'll be like listening to the radio station. They'll be like, "Hey, we went silent for 10 seconds or something like that," and they're like actually physically there. And there's like a bunch of alerts and everything like that. And they're just like coming at us like, "Hey, I want to deliver the best webcast as possible." And I don't know. I think the passion that these people put into their like broadcasts and stuff like that is really eye-opening.
Yeah, Reza.
Yeah. So. Is it true that if you have an FM radio station here in the US, that you have also the rights to retransmit that on the internet? I think it comes bundled in with the FM license, and so in a startup that I helped some years ago, we used the ICE radio protocol to retransmit the FM stations and made a sort of a reskinnable app that radio stations could use. That's where we saw tremendous amount of engagement. Normally radios are one way, you're listening passively, you're in the car, but now you've got this app where you can just with one touch maybe like that song, swipe left, swipe right if you want to, or engage with advertising. I think that showed a tremendous amount of, it showed that there was a massive audience out there. And isn't radio, after all, the #1 music discovery medium out there still? Not to be underestimated.
So we have this massive engagement on internet radio. And I truly would not use that word conservatively. It is a massive engagement. Why do you think it is? You know, we were sort of making jokes at the beginning of the session about internet audio being treated as a second-class citizen. So with a big engagement like this, why is this the first time I've seen in years? I've had to almost talk streaming media into doing a focus session on internet audio. That as a community, we deliver more ad impressions, or at least engage with more users, many times over compared to the video world. Why do you think this has come about, that it's sort of forgotten about, or is it just a solved problem that no one needs to address, or is there anything that jumps to mind?
I'll jump in if you don't mind. I sometimes think that, unfortunately, the word radio has some connotations that make people feel like it's a dinosaur in the tar pits, that it's a dead format and it's not moving forward. And really, the statistics on it are not that at all. Setting aside internet radio for a second and just talking about broader terrestrial radio, it's still a $29 billion industry, according to Nielsen. There's 44,000 radio stations in the world. 75% of the world's population listens to radio every single week. 93% of Americans listen to radio every single week. That dwarfs even all of the rest of streaming music combined. It's 5 times as big as all that. And so I think there's a misnomer out there. I think there's this belief that format is no longer interesting, and yet when you take a look at utilization trends, you take a look at the number of minutes that a listener uses and spends on broadcast radio, it's rock solid at almost 110 minutes a day across the board. So I think, unfortunately, there's kind of this paradox in the industry right now where people just aren't paying attention to it, but that's not true of listeners. Yeah. Listeners pay attention to it very, very closely.
Any other thoughts, guys, on why that perception is, why the internet radio and audio?
I don't know. I think we have to follow the money. I guess follow the money. I don't know if the advertising model is generating the same level of return as video advertising. But I know in my household and when I'm around, I use radio, internet radio in particular, to kind of fill the silence in the home. I love having the sound of radio. Homes in Los Angeles, but the company headquarters are in Seattle. So I'm in an apartment in Seattle, and I wake up in the morning. More often than not, I'd yell at Alexa from across the room to play KCRW, or just so that I can feel comforted that I'm not in the 405 traffic. It's a different 405 up there. Or alternatively, being able to, and you can tell from my accent, I'm from back east, and I might ask the radio station to play BBC Radio 4, just to have a comforting voice in the background. And that ability to be able to access radio from all over the world and enjoy that wherever you are. I think that's one of the great values of internet radio, to be able to do that across the internet. It needs to be, maybe it's just our secret.
Yeah, sometimes.
I think it's probably also got something to do with the fact that the authorities, particularly in the UK, they're really intent on continuing to push DAB and try and make a success of the investment that they've made there, because they're sending that message out to the populace that DAB is only really the new digital way to listen to radio. That people are not really naturally migrating towards internet radio and that as a method of consumption.
Or maybe they've migrated, but they're not conscious that they've migrated.
Radio's radio.
A lot of people, you ask them, have you listened to any internet radio? And they'll be listening to it, and they'll say, oh no, I don't think I ever have. But they're actually actively opening their favourite channel when they get to work every morning and so on.
And obviously the ratings also works on something like Radio in the UK, which is really important to the actual stations themselves. So without having those solid numbers from the radar, then their listings they're not going to push the audience towards internet radio.
So that's a good segue. So on the subject of ratings, how well integrated do you guys find across your different platforms that being able to report in a useful way, especially to ratings agencies, the traditional ad panels and so on, what stage is the industry at with that type of technical integration?
It's search. I mean, publishers want search on anything, anything. They literally want to be able to see the whole data set Obviously, the reporting bodies, they have kind of a strict standard that we kick out very easy PDF quarterly reports for them, and away it goes. That's pretty much as far as we get involved in it.
Right.
Yeah, similarly, I know that for our business, kind of at a fundamental level, it's not really something that we pay attention to, but our clients do. So I know that clients like iHeartMedia, it matters to them very deeply, and we actually do a lot of integration work to ensure that everything that we're doing on the on-demand side of the services we provide for them can be metered effectively and kind of show up in the ratings. Because when it comes to the advertising monetization, that's still really fundamental. Now, there are companies in the world like Triton and others who are starting to change that dynamic a little bit because it's much more kind of traditionally internet driven in its measurability, and there's a broader set of metrics than just the ratings that can be used to bolster the value of that. So I think the more and more kind of internet connectivity you wind up getting that kind of transcends both broadcast and internet radio, it may become less important over time. But right now it still matters to the traditional guys.
And John, is Live 365 integrated with sound exchanges over here, or who do you have to report to?
We cover full licensing on Live 365 for the US, Canada, and the UK. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different requirements for different performing rights organizations or collection societies about, how do you measure a sound recording? One might have one definition with Sound Exchange, whereas Resound in Canada might have a different definition of, hey, you can factor out this percentage of sound recordings because of the internet or whatever, whereas Sound Exchange is very strict and black and white about how you measure that, how you report it. And yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different metrics and stuff like that about, performances and how do you actually get accurate metadata and report that to the different licensing bodies and all of that stuff. And I mean, it's definitely getting there. It's progressing a lot well. It's actually progressing really well, whereas Sound Exchange opened up their ISRC API, so you can actually tap into it and actually attribute certain data with different performances and all of that. So I think it's constantly a battle about obviously correcting data, especially on a user-generated content platform. But yeah, it's definitely progressing well, and it's a lot of data to manage, but somebody has to do it.
Reza, are you finding?
Yeah, and I don't know whether that maybe is the answer to it. If the reporting platforms became more pervasive, if there was more accurate, more up-to-date reporting in almost real time, I think that might show advertisers that, hey, there is an audience, and this is how it's broken up, and this is this is how to better target your advertising.
There's been certainly discrepancies between audiences when they've been measured by the traditional methods and measurement by internet methods. We can be so much more, arguably, so much more accurate with internet measurement and so on. And I think they sell the advertising packages and so on.
The whole experience of listening to radio, as I described, I love to have it on in the background. Compare that with engaging with video clips, small video clips. You more reliably will know that a user's engaged with that content, especially if they're clicking onto the next small clip. But radio in the background with interstitial commercials, you're not as certain that that message got through to the user. So I can see why the figures would be somewhat muddied.
There's another dynamic, and I'm not an expert at this, but from the clients that we've spoken to, another dynamic that may be in play here, and that's that the traditional broadcasters, they have a very long established method for selling their advertising. It tends to be hyper-local, tends to be kind of very old school, out there working with advertisements that get on the air. Those advertisements, those same advertisements can't be delivered over the internet. There are licensing restrictions with the performance guilds and things like that don't allow that to happen. So there are companies out there that, when a simulcast is being created, will replace those advertisements with advertisements that can be delivered out on the internet and retarget them if they can know where that stream is going so that you're getting something else that's a balance. But part of this could fundamentally just be that there's a real difference between the ad sales cycles and where a lot of volume of ad sales occurs and how it's like a different ad sales cycle that's occurring on the internet side of things. And part of it could just simply get down to growth. As big as radio still is, it isn't growing as fast as other streaming categories, and sometimes just the volume of growth is enough to attract attention, right? It's all shiny and everybody likes to go after that.
So while we're sort of touching on rights and reporting and so on, how especially Reza and Ken, you guys, I suppose John as well, how are you guys finding dealing with the licensing bodies these days? Because I certainly know Ken was probably public enemy number one a while ago, and are we now part of friends with that community, or are we still the pirates?
Well, I think for the community overall, I think that by and large, internet radio and online music delivery is now very much the friend of the industry. I think that for a long time, the industry tried to figure out exactly how much they were going to get behind each of these various models. But the fact now that the streaming music services themselves have been able to help the record industry turn their revenues around for the first time after a 12-year very, very steep decline, now 2-3 years worth of consistent revenue growth, that's been a very good story. If there's anything that's a challenge from my perspective right now with the licensors is that they're so excited about the fact that the revenues have moved in the right direction, particularly on the backs of kind of what we all know is like that $10 a month streaming subscription model, that sometimes it takes a lot of work to get them to step back and think about other hybrid models. Licensing frameworks that aren't covered by Sound Exchange in the US and don't neatly fall in the confines of $10 a month subscription, that maybe hybridize and create a little bit of on-demand that's interspersed with an otherwise kind of live, temporal streaming experience. Those kinds of things can be difficult. It takes a lot of time and energy and effort to get them to come around to that. We have a couple products launching in a few months that we've been able to get some really interesting license for that we're excited about, but they take many, many months of discussion to kind of get the rights holders to that point.
And John, with Live 365, it must be quite a challenge because you don't know necessarily what your broadcasters are going to broadcast, so clearing rights must be...
Yeah, no, I actually really enjoy it. I mean, so copyright law is one of my passions. I mean, I don't actively study it, but I think it's really intriguing, especially understanding the DMCA and how different parts of a copyright exist on one song, and there's several different components with ephemeral rights and caching and all of that fun stuff. It's super eye-opening. I think working with the different rights organizations, I mean, we bring a really good value proposition with Live 365 to the market because there's so many tens of thousands of pirate radio stations out there broadcasting completely to the internet. They have no idea about licensing. They might say, hey, I have an ASCAP license, which is a PRO here in the US. My broadcast is covered, whereas it's actually not. So for us going approaching the different collection societies and stuff like that, here's our value proposition. We're helping people get legal. We're lowering the barrier to entry from both a tech side and obviously getting full licensing coverage. So they've actually been pretty receptive to it, for sure.
Reza, you must have seen the rights world change over the RealNetworks history.
I have, but also in my previous position, I was one of the founders of a DRM company called Widevine Technologies, where we developed a DRM to secure paid television. In the early days, the use of cryptography was, we first pitched it as a loss prevention, as a theft prevention technology. And you got you got your foot in the door, but it was only when we pivoted the pitch to say, okay, this isn't going to be used for anti-piracy, it's more to enable you to sell your catalog content on the internet. And that's when the studio conversation started to really accelerate, and we pivoted the company Widevine into something that was really attractive and eventually got acquired by Google. So the question about what the expectations are of the rights holders, of the content owners, it's a conversation that you have to have with them, and you have to bring them along. And I feel like maybe that evolution of expectation has happened in the video domain, but not so much in the music domain. There's still, it's still incredibly difficult for a streaming music service to be profitable. And I think, Ken, isn't it right that Rhapsody, Napster is the only profitable music service, bar none?
I'm proud to say that's true, at least.
And so it's incredibly challenging. And so, Ken's company's got the benefit of having, legacy deals with the rights owners and very broad deals, but a newcomer to the space, even in the last 4 or 5 years, last 10 years would be struggling to make a profit. And as we know, many of them are in a hole and digging the hole deeper. So it has to be. I think there's an evolution of the expectation of the rights holders is due.
So there's been a couple of changes, certainly this side of the pond, hasn't there? There's been the Music Modernisation Act, and the year before that, wasn't it? There's a permission that webcasters had fell away as part of the DMCA. I can't remember that one, but I know the Music Modernisation Act has come through in the last couple of months and so on. Do you think the lobby is generally with the industry at the moment, or do you think we've still got some challenges to overcome?
Well, I'd say with the industry in general, but with the caveat that a lot of the newer legislation really is coming up sort of in the spirit of ensuring that the underlying creative artists are compensated fairly. And this has been like, a charge that's been kind of levied at the streaming industry for a long time, that artists don't make a lot of money off these business models, et cetera, et cetera. The record labels, I think you can see from their financial results that they're actually doing quite nicely off of it. Sometimes, and I'm not going to cast any aspersions at them, sometimes it's very difficult for artists to be able to tease apart who's keeping what portion of the pie. And sometimes it's not just the streaming companies that really are keeping the big portion of that pie. Artists should look really carefully at the deals that they sign with their labels as well as part of it. But be that as it may, the one portion of the industry that really does get addressed by the MMA is the publishing side. These are the songwriters. And this has been problematic because the songwriters and the agencies supporting the songwriters, I think, they had a harder problem to solve. It's very easy for us to know exactly what record label is providing what track to our service, but it's much more difficult to be able to know the 15, 20, 30 individual composers that might be represented on those tracks. And the caliber and the quality and metadata there has not been great, and that's been a known and serious problem for the industry. So I think getting a better legal framework and a better compensation framework for those folks actually does help the industry in the long term. So.
Okay, cool. So we've done a bit of the evolution of the sector, a little bit of the challenges and the rights issues and so on. Should we let everyone loose and talk a bit of tech? There's a chuckle from this end of the camp. So some tech's been sort of come and gone over the years. I understand Winamp is about to do a re-release. I read last week, so that's good to see the llama back. But obviously we had MP3 falling out into license free. Everyone marked it as let's start with that one. I remember a bunch of articles coming out that MP3 had finally died. And I actually personally thought finally the chains have come off and it's free. Discuss. What do you think with MP3's licensing change over the last year? Do you think it's marking the death knell, or do you think it's the beginning of a new resurgence?
I think it's got the ability to get people involved in the industry without fear that they're breaking any laws or rights. I think that's one of the key things. It's still widely used and accessible by most internet radio devices from even 10, 15 years ago who played MP3. So I don't think it's died in any way. I'm not sure it will be used as the primary codec going forward, just because of the flexibility that AAC MP4 will give you in the general environment. But yeah, I think it's a long, long way from dead.
Are you guys all delivering in MP3?
A little bit. We're principally AC4 as well, yeah. So I kind of tend to agree. I think maybe to some degree it's a bit of a survival move, right? There was enough industry movement kind of away and towards newer formats that there was perhaps a certain amount of inevitability in it. It's still highly relevant, though. I agree with that. We still deliver in it as well, certain content. So, we'll continue to support it as long as content providers continue to produce in it.
John?
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think it's ever going to go away. I mean, personally, with Live 365, we have to deal with a lot of legacy integrations. For example, Roku supports obviously MP3, so we have to deal with a lot of those endpoints that publishers have a presence somewhere, but it's maybe something that was built 5 or 10 years ago, but they still have a user that wants to connect to it. So I don't think it's really going to grow, but I don't think it'll ever go away just because of the mass adoption of so many legacy devices out there that are still connected and still being used by a bunch of listeners from all around the world. I do think though, publishers will, continue to push 2 or 3 different kind of codecs. really to kind of help with like the user experience, like with Live 365, starting to use like AAC codecs because we really want to focus on like the user experience, delivering it at like a lower bit rate, especially as we push a lot more on mobile. But yeah, I don't think it'll ever end up going away, but yeah.
So from the tech point of view, I hear a notion that the audio encoding is a solved problem and no need to do any more innovation in that area. Whereas when on the video side, the industry is constantly pushing higher resolution. We're now at HD, beyond HD, we're at 4K, and then the television monitor manufacturers want to push 8K now, maybe even with increased frame rate. So that's incredibly important. And then the higher dynamic range for color, HDR, is being pushed. What's happening to audio? Is audio still the red-headed stepchild? So I've been looking recently at okay, what audio codecs could match the increase of the video experience. If you're going to go from standard definition all the way up to 4K, 8K, shouldn't the audio experience also be enhanced? So I've been looking at some more modern codecs, at least ones that give you a higher fidelity, like MQA. I know that some of my colleagues over at Rhapsody have also had a look at that area. MQA gives you almost studio quality experience in a coded stream. And then there's some more immersive audio formats, multi-channel, surround formats that are worth looking at. Again, they don't get much priority in terms of product or service speccing. And when I go back to my original foray into audio, my recollection when we were building one of the first non-linear editing machines, it was called Lightworks from the UK, we focused on the audio experience first, and the video was a slave that followed the audio track. So when the editor was cutting the audio, we made sure that we gave them that same experience that you'd get on a Steinbeck or a Moviola controller, where you felt like you had tangible possession of the media and you were dragging it across a magnetic head. That's the feel that we wanted to give to the media. And so we used the audio as the master clock. After all, the audio sample frequency is much higher than your video frame rate. And the video just had to follow the audio. And that way we got the best user experience in engaging with the material, with the content at the creation side. But I think that same level of attention and diligence needs to be applied now on the consumption side. And not just making the audio louder, but I think there's a lot more that can be done to make the consumption experience of audio, just taking it up a notch, the way we do it in video.
So I don't know if you guys, before I skip on to it, I was going to move us on to just looking at the end-to-end sort of ecosystem of streaming audio and so on. But before we do, since we're on codecs, any other thoughts on what's coming next with codecs? Reza touched on it.
Well, I do think high res is an emerging format. MQA is a company that's providing kind of a codec on top of the high res definition, which essentially says it's 96K or better in the studio, 128K or better, all the way through the production cycle from the studio on down. And we're going to be launching a fully high res service with a major partner in Japan here in the next few months or so. It's going to be interesting to see. I think one of the debates in the industry overall is just that underlying codec actually enough? And it does it create in an oral setting enough of a delineation? The move from 4K to 8K or the move from 720 to 1080p on a television set, that's very obvious to people. Kind of blind listening tests, it's a little trickier to hear the difference between a 320 kbps stream and a full high-res stream, or even a lossless FLAC versus a CD quality like 44K sampled versus a 96 sampled. It's a little touchier. We may be kind of getting right at the verge of kind of what the human ear is able to really discern on an ongoing basis. We actually play around with a lot more technologies that kind of sit around that, even things like personalization and optimization. We have a feature in our app called EarPrint that will allow you to take a set of headphones and essentially you go through an ear-by-ear listening test, and it creates a custom EQ profile for you that adjusts like frequency responses and volumes on each ear. And that in and of itself provides a massive difference to users. So sometimes it might not be the underlying codec that matters the most, but everything else that kind of wraps around the delivery process to create a great experience.
Cool. Okay. So let's just have a little last chat about the end-to-end ecosystem for streaming, and then there'll be hopefully time for a couple of quick questions from the floor if you've got any. So I was always a big fan of Icecast. Obviously, I've started off with Real, but Icecast, I still to this day run an Icecast internet radio station, and it's just very ubiquitous, very reliable, and so on. But there's always moments where you think that some of the smartphones in particular are going to stop ICY, stop progressive download type streaming and so on. And I noticed that more and more services, Mixcloud comes to mind immediately, they're using MP4 encapsulation so they can do nice chapter markers and so on and so forth. I'm scattergunning a little bit here, but another thing that I noticed was the audio tags in HTML5, horrifically inconsistent across the browsers. Managed to hopefully get Chrome to actually bring its audio player controls down to the same height as the other two browsers after persisting with them for a few weeks. But I find it, again, treated like a second citizen. But tell me, with you guys, where's the ecosystem at the moment? What sort of servers are you having to support? Is it all just following the video world into HLS? Is there anything new on the horizon? Dane?
ICY is still pretty relevant in the marketplace that we operate in. But that said, they are moving towards HLS, and that is primarily because of the advertising services that sits underneath it, the access that you can get across the modern devices, people moving between cells on the road, the drive time users, the guys going on the London Underground, etc. HLS is a far better supported format for that kind of listening, if you're thinking about just a consistent listening experience across anything that you're using. So they're the kind of protocols that we're having to support. We haven't really seen much other movement other than from ICY to HLS.
Yeah, we switched to HLS across the board, a year and a half ago, something like that, 2 years ago, for all the reasons that I won't go back over, same ones, which is really true. The thing that we're actually starting to see that's interesting from an end-to-end solution is the beginnings of stitching together different technologies simultaneously to deliver a listening experience. So, for example, the integration that we did with iHeart, an iHeart listener may be listening to one of their terrestrial broadcast radio stations simulcast in internet format and hear a song that they like and decide that they want to replay that song, so they can kind of hit a repeat button. But it's not going back through the internet scan for that. It's actually running a match between the catalog and pinging our service and hitting our files on an on-demand basis. The end user doesn't recognize or see that difference at all. It's bouncing back and forth between two completely different delivery mechanisms and entities to create a seamless listening experience for the end user. And when you think about kind of the evolution of like even technologies in the car, right, that have AM, FM receivers, many of them have satellite receivers, many of them now are starting to come shipped with their own SIM card. So the car itself is like a mobile phone. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to start to understand or see how you could begin to hybridize delivery experiences that kind of mix together broadcast signal with internet provided signal that's being delivered through the SIM and create much more interactive and kind of mixes of what's really cool about live terrestrial radio interspersed a little bit with personalization, things of that nature. And honestly, we believe that really the future of that transcends just the music. It should be every piece of what makes a radio experience really great, delivered in a traditional format, but also with kind of on-demand control and the ability to access subcomponent parts or personalize those to fit your use case. So I think that hybridization is really a big part of the future for this format.
John, for formats?
Yeah, I don't ever see IC ever going away. I mean, just kind of for the same reason with the MP3 codecs. I mean, it's super widely adopted, especially with like different automation systems that our webcasters use and like encoders and all of that. And obviously like the client being able to receive it on like Roku, for example. But I definitely see a lot of larger players kind of adopting more of like HLS or MPEG-Dash or anything like that, just because, you know, it really helps empower the user experience. Because if you're relying on an IC connection with a persistent connection and you're dropping out by going to a different cell network, you're going to have buffering, and you know that user might delete your app, might not ever come back or whatever. So it's really about just providing like that continuous, you know, linear stream in the best possible fashion. So,
Cool.
Right. So, if you cast your mind back to real audio and what streaming in those days looked like, it was very session based. It was all the buffering logic was very much on the server side, and of course eminently unscalable, because it's great for 1,000 streams, but if you want to go to 1,000,000 streams, you know, your server rack had to grow, and so the industry moved completely to the other end and moved the buffering logic all to the client, and the server became a dumb HTTP server, so HLS. Perhaps we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater there. Yes, you've got an eminently scalable solution where all the client devices now know what their capability is to receive content and streams, and are able to request what they need. But we've lost some of the ability to the random access capability of the content, and the stream startup times are incredibly slow, and the rebuffering is ridiculous. And if you want to move the playhead, you have to now incur a huge rebuffering cost. So, having said that, I sat through this morning's update by the inventor of HLS, and it was encouraging to see that the protocol is continuing to evolve and handle all sorts of use cases. So, I do see streaming services, video or audio, moving more towards HLS, and what you get with it is also the huge support of server-side ad insertion, dynamic ad insertion, and if we're following the money, that's definitely going to sway the argument. And so what we're finding in our OTT, with our OTT partners in China, is the need for an additional ingredient to the streaming topology and streaming protocols is that of peer-to-peer. In China, there's a different problem, is that the CDN infrastructure simply can't support the demand of the streaming bandwidth. Eyeballs have moved largely mobile, and I guess listening is also mobile. The amount of mobile consumption of the internet in China just outpaces the West, and so if each consumer, each stream is going to be a unique session for each instance, that puts a tremendous load on the CDN. And so what we've started to do is started to add a hybrid streaming solution where it's largely peer-to-peer. If your neighbors asked for the same content that you have, then we simply broker a connection to your neighbor, and it gets fed in a peer-to-peer fashion. And the WebRTC technologies, and there's some blockchain technologies, the IPFS technology is also emerging in that space to provide this peer-to-peer infrastructure that will sort of help hybridize your streaming protocol. In China, it's a necessity to come up with solutions like that. And what it does is it offloads the traffic from the CDN bandwidth, and your subscribers are picking up the transport bill through their own local internet connection rather than you as a service operator.
Any questions from the floor, guys? Got a couple of minutes, so if you've got any questions, now is the time. Sure.
I actually have two questions. One's technical and one's more strategy. What happened to quad audio? Quad audio?
Quad audio. What happened to quad audio?
Stereo, then there's quad.
Quadraphonic.
Oh, quadraphonic.
I still see quite a lot of quadraphonic systems in clubs, but they're for PA audio. I haven't seen it on a streaming
Yeah,
format.
from an audio consumption standpoint, I mean, I think you could maybe make the argument that a lot of high fidelity listening in general kind of has fallen out of favor. In many, many ways, I think the television experience in 5.1 and stuff like that kind of took over that desire or need for it. And now so much of the listening is mobile, a lot more of it coming even with lucky if you've got stereo connected speakers, wireless speakers in your home right now.
You don't have a vibration isolation mount for your phone then.
When's the last time you got to go out to like Magnolia Hi-Fi and buy a stack of speakers as tall as your, I mean, it's unfortunately it's kind of a sad state of affairs that I think the market demand for those kinds of really high-end listening experiences kind of waned a bit. Maybe they'll come back. I can only hope.
Did you have a second question?
Yeah,
Sir?
it's more of a strategy on terrestrial radio. It's now you get all these streaming services, so people can get their stuff on demand. How does terrestrial radio survive going forward? Do they go hyper-local, or what do they do? Does personality start to rise? How do they differentiate?
So just quickly for the webcast, the question from the floor is how does terrestrial radio adapt in the face of all the new internet delivered audio content? Any thoughts, Panna?
It's a question on how you see your listening to radio change from one technology to another. So I think the biggest innovation at the moment is the smart speaker, and that's replacing FM and DAB radios within someone's home. So it doesn't mean that necessarily that broadcaster needs to change or adapt. It just means that user's moved from using FM or DAB to just asking Alexa to listen to its favorite radio station as normal. And that's actually seeing an enormous amount of natural growth happen in Europe, where smart speakers have launched. They've already become number 2 and 3 in terms of the consumption method for those stations. So I don't know whether they necessarily need to change what they're doing. I just think that they're another part of the pie now.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think that when you take a look at like a Pandora-like experience, even at their best, when they're intertwining podcasts and things like that, they don't replicate the radio experience. They don't replicate the unique curation experience that radio brings. And so I do think that underlying delivery technologies will evolve and they'll start to hybridize. And in certain cases, like in the home on wireless speakers, they'll completely shift from like big antennas on top of a hill to internet protocols delivering that stuff. But the unique content that they provide, which is today hyper-local, remains hyper-local, and it's very important to them. The big providers that we talk to in the space believe in that format, believe that hyper-localization continues to be the thing that will keep them relevant, believe that the mix of content that they deliver continues to keep them relevant, but are looking for ways to bring that into the 21st century. So I think the smart ones will find ways to blend together some personalization and on-demand features to be able to make the experience richer without giving up the unique combination of content and the hyper-local sensitivities that they bring to the market. Because I think there's still a reason why it's the most listened to format in the car, and it's not just because it's easy to turn on. No. There's a lot of easy integrations with a lot of services, and I think there's other value that people place in the radio experience.
Yeah.
Technically, sorry.
I was going to say, I think another thing too is them finding out a strategy about their actual content, because it definitely boils down to content is king. And for us on the Empire side, like we see a lot of customers they will take like a live show and they'll record it and then they'll repurpose it as a podcast or deliver it in another way where it's still the same content getting in front of the same user. It's just more of a different experience of how that's being consumed versus like it being live or repurposed and on demand later. So I think that's one strategy that terrestrial broadcasters are taking.
Cool. Reza, any last comments?
So the question, how does terrestrial radio survive? I think it has to evolve, but it doesn't mean not transmitting over the air. I think the answer might lie in augmenting the transmission with a stream service. turns out in the US, with your FM license, you get the ability to restream the content over the internet. And as I mentioned, one of the startups I worked on, we try to promote that experience of the trusted DJ in the small town that has the ear of a community. They can further augment the service with an app-based experience. And so when he says, caller number 10, that could be a person dialing up, or it could be a button that emerges on your app and you just get to press it. And so you get to either respond to a quiz or a competition, or get the last 10 tickets, going to the local high school football game, and getting those. So it's that type of hybridization and embracing the new medium, rather than just doing a hard switch over.
I would love to carry on this conversation and let you guys dehydrate and not drink coffee, but there's a coffee break outside. Somebody's thirsty, somebody needs to wake up, and we need to thank this panel because they've been awesome. Thank you for coming, guys.